I usually like to use fast lenses for wildlife photography, mainly because I enjoy this smooth and creamy background that kind of helps to separate the subject from the background. Nevertheless, I think that these rather expensive, heavy and large telephoto lenses that have a rather fast aperture are not always the best choice for everybody. Especially for beginners, but even professional photographers such as myself and many of my friends sometimes prefer to use a slower lens, which is sometimes a zoom or a slower prime lens, for several reasons. At the same time, these big fast prime lenses can also be irreplaceable for some situations, so it really depends what kind of images you want to take. And in this video I want to help you to talk a bit about some of the maybe more obvious differences between the lenses, but also some things that I think many people often miss, what is really a more hidden advantage of one of the two lenses. And in the end of the video I also want to give you some recommendations in case you're looking for a zoom lens or another telephoto lens that is not as fast and as expensive as a 600mm f4. The first and very obvious advantage of buying such a fast telephoto lens is that the lens lets in more light into the camera, which ultimately leads to better image quality. And especially in wildlife photography, where we have many animals that are most active at dawn or dusk, such as deer, moose and so on, or we have birds that are often moving fast and we need to select a short shutter speed. These are all situations where we are happy if we can get in a bit more light by a larger aperture and get away with better image quality. And to give you an example of how big the difference is, we have here my RF 600mm f4, and here I have the Nikon 180 to 600mm f5.6 to 6.3. So at 600mm we have f6.3, and this means there is one-third stop of difference between the two lenses. With other words, the 600mm f4 lets in more than twice the light than this lens here. And this means if I'm out in the forest, it's a bit dark, I'm maybe at 3200 ISO with the RF 600mm f4, which is still quite okay. It would mean that with this lens here, if I also use it at the most open aperture, I would be at 8000 ISO already. And if it starts getting darker, maybe it starts raining, I might need to crank up the ISO more. I'm at 6400 ISO on this lens, which is still quite fine on a full frame camera, and here I'm touching 16,000 ISO, which is tolerable, but even with the most modern denoising algorithms you start seeing a loss in details, dynamic range, and also the color usually looks less nice. As I mentioned before, these fast lenses also allow us to have a better subject to background separation by making the background a bit smoother. That's one thing that I just like for my style of photography. It's ultimately up to you if this is important to you or not. And it also allows us to include like a blurry foreground more easily. This can be if you have some birds that are more ground dwelling. If you go really low, you can have the grass as a blurry foreground, or you can photograph through bushes and have the leaves and the branches kind of blurry in the image, maybe even with some nice color if the bush is flowering or if it's autumn and you have these yellow-orange leaves. Again, it's not everybody's style, but this is just something that is much easier to do with a fast telephoto lens such as this one here. I love to go out when there is some special light, and I really like to have backlit situations at sunrise or sunset, and especially at the sea or at lakes, when in the background you have some reflection in the water, and then because they are out of focus they turn into these kind of bokeh balls in the backgrounds, these flares, and these flares get bigger when you have a faster aperture lens. and this makes quite a difference. While you still get these flares with the 600mm f6.3, they will just look smoother and bigger with the 600mm f4. And I want to show you an example here. The one image is taken with 300mm f2.8, the other one with 300mm f4, and you can already see quite a big difference. And with these two lenses here, the difference would even be more pronounced. Since fast lenses let in more light into the sensor, it usually also means that the autofocus is faster, and almost more important for me, it's more reliable. This is especially the case when it's rather a dark environment, again maybe taking pictures after sunset or so. I need to say that with mirrorless cameras this is not so much of a deal as it has been like 10 years ago with DSLRs, and even a lens like the 100 to 600mm, it's a 6.3 lens, but I never really had autofocus issues with this lens. You feel that such a lens here, like the 600mm f4, can have some advantages, but I would not worry too much, except if you really shoot a lot in these kind of extreme situations. And also if you use tele extenders, usually the prime lenses deal better with these tele extenders, both in the autofocus and also in image quality. And in general, all or most of the lenses, they benefit if you stop a bit down. They tend to get sharper. With the 600mm 6.3, maybe you don't want to stop down too much because of the background or because your ISO are starting to increase to a value that you don't feel comfortable with anymore. Whereas with the 600mm f4 you have so much light that sometimes you can stop down a bit, and then usually you even improve the sharpness, especially when including a teleconverter. But there are also several downsides of these big and fast telephoto lenses. First of all, the price. I don't know the price in US dollars exactly, but in terms of euros, I know that the Canon RF 600mm f4 is around 6 times the price than the Nikon 180-600. And that's quite a difference. I mean, for this money, you can go on a very nice photography trip. You can buy many other lenses. So you need to decide if it's worth it for you or not. And even if you have the money and you say, okay, I want to spend a bit more money on photography, that's okay with me. Maybe stick with me here for a few more minutes, because there are other downsides of these big telephoto lenses. For example, it's very heavy and large. As you can see, it's so much larger than the 180-600mm, and while the 180-600 weighs around 2 kilos, this one is a bit more than 3 kilos, so it's 1 kilogram heavier. These lenses got extremely light compared to how they were like 10-20 years ago, but still they are heavier than a bit slower lenses. So that's something to consider. And this here is a 180-600mm zoom, so it covers a wide range of focal lengths, and with this 600mm f4 I'm limited to 600mm, so to cover the range from 180 to 600 I would need a second lens, which makes the whole setup even heavier. And you can feel this obviously when you handhold the lens for a longer period of time. Let's say you're waiting for a kingfisher that is perched on a small branch, you're waiting for it to take off. I cannot hold this lens here for 5 minutes and wait until it takes off. With a lighter lens, it might be possible. And the same is true if you want to go for some specific angles, and sometimes if I want to go really low, I hold the lens upside down like out of a boat and try to take pictures like this. Again, it works with the 600mm f4, but it's much less stable. The keeper rate is lower than if I just use a much lighter lens. And also for just following birds in flight, a smaller and lighter lens is usually much better. It doesn't matter so much when you take pictures of storks or herons that just pass by, but if you have swifts or swallows that have a faster and more erratic flight pattern, it really can make a difference. And you can also see how super long this 600mm f4 is. And this can be a problem because I'm sure I'm not the first and not the last photographer that actually needed to buy a new backpack after upgrading the lens, because it just physically didn't fit in the backpack anymore. Cool, now I have a new backpack, but the new backpack is heavier than my old one, even if it's empty. And it's also bigger, obviously, which makes it more annoying in some small trains or buses when I'm traveling. if you take it to the plane, this can also make it a bit more complicated. So that's once again a situation where the smaller lens has a clear benefit. Since the depth of field is so small with these 600mm f4 lenses or 400mm 2.8 lenses, it means that there is a very small margin of error that you have because before the image looks kind of blurry. If you put the focus point a bit in the wrong position, or if the camera just misses focus a bit, you will see it much more easily on a lens like this than on the 180-600. Of course, this is only true if you use this f4. If you stop down, you can avoid it, but then what's the point of having a lens like this? And the final point that I want to make is sometimes the depth of field can just be too shallow. You don't have the whole bird sharp in frame anymore. Maybe just the head is sharp, but the beak is blurry and the tail is blurry, and maybe the background is kind of I mean, it's not so close, it's not so distracting, and you could stop down a bit more. And then these lenses here definitely have an advantage, because in this situation, why should you have such a big lens if you stop it down anyway? Granted, they have a bit better image quality usually if you stop them down compared to these ones here wide open, but honestly, for this bit of image quality, I would happily trade this bit of image quality for having a lighter lens. So I think I covered the most important pros and cons of having such a fast telephoto lens. If you think I forgot some or you don't agree with something, just let me know down in the comments. And I also wanted to mention some of the good lenses that I know that are a bit slower, but also lighter, less expensive and smaller. So one obvious one that we have here is the Nikon 180-600mm f 5.6 to 6.3. I'm very happy with the sharpness. I like that it's an internal zoom, and with just like, I would say, not even a quarter of a turn, you can zoom from 180 to 600mm, which is great if you quickly want to zoom. Yeah, overall a very good lens. If you want something even lighter, you can go for the 600mm f6.3 or for the 400mm f4.5. Both of them are smaller, lighter, even sharper, faster autofocus, but they have the disadvantage that they are prime lenses, so you're less flexible, and they're also a bit more expensive. So you need to see what makes most sense for you. If you are a Sony shooter, there is the Sony 200-600mm. Unfortunately, while I have used it a few times, I could not really test it in detail, but I've read good things about it. If you are shooting Canon, there is, in my opinion, two options. There is for once the RF 100-500mm 4.5 to 7.1 that is here in the shelf behind me. And if you are often craving for a bit more focal length, there is the RF 200-800mm f6.3 to f9. f9 might sound a bit intimidating, but if you use a Nikon 180-600 or Sony 200-600 and you add the 1.4 extender, you're at 840mm f9 as well, so there's not really much of a difference. And the RF 200-800mm is also a cool lens. About these lenses that I mentioned now, I did separate videos about all these lenses, also comparing them. I linked them below if you're curious about one or the other. And if you want to learn more how you can get like a blurrier, less distracting background and more impactful images, then please check out my ebook. I linked it down below.